Welcome back. I'm Khalil Charles. About half of more than 50 countries in the African Union have presidents, prime ministers or monarchs who have been in power for decades. Robert Mugabe has been in power in Zimbabwe since 1980. Paul Biya has governed Cameroon since 1982. And President Museveni has governed Uganda since 1986. African Republican countries have constitutions that limit presidential terms to just 2 years. Yet this year alone, we've seen a spate of third election term bids and attempts to change the constitution to allow incumbent leaders to stay in power. A number of attempts have led to violence in countries like Burundi and in the Ivory Coast. So are extended terms good for democracy in Africa? To discuss this, we have Archie Henry, a journalist in Rwanda, where President Kagame recently had his third term extended, and Eve Frank from the Amnesty International, who produced a report this week entitled Treated Like Criminals, revealing how the Democratic Republic of Congo's justice system is being used to silence critics of President Kabila's third term bid. And Ibrahima Kane, an advocate from the African Union, is also on the line to join us. Thanks very much indeed for coming to the programme. Now, if I can start with Archie. Archie, can you tell us, because in your country you've got a president who has extended his term, could you give us first an idea, what is a two-term presidency and what does it mean to the Rwandans now in your country that presidency has been extended?
Right. So first of all, I think it's important to look at the extension of term limits or mandates in Africa as not like there is a trend, but it really depends on a case-by-case basis. And I think the Rwandan case is quite interesting, especially compared to its neighbor Burundi, because in Burundi there was no constitutional change. They went with the constitution and argued it was actually legal for the president to get a third term, whereas in Rwanda there was a constitutional change, but with a wide popular backing. So some may argue that this was indeed influenced by stakeholders at top in the ruling party, for example. But there are a lot of Rwandans who actually see Paul Kagame as a figure of stability and are not quite sure what will come afterwards. Of course, there are also Rwandans who oppose it. But the two-term limits among those that supported his third term didn't mean too much. For them, the term limits were subject to change because the Constitution was written by the people, and again, it could be changed by the people. So that's sort of what the constitutional change looks like in Rwanda. A little bit different than other countries because a lot of popular involvement through petitions, for example.
Thanks for that, Archie, because what you've said there with regard to the way Rwanda has accepted the third-term presidency is not the same situation in Burundi and is not the same situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Evie, you've done some work and currently a researcher for Amnesty International. And what has been your findings with regard to the way in which the third presidency bid from President Kabila has been accepted?
Well, so we've seen that there's a lot of people who have spoken out against the idea of a third term. To be clear, at this point, President Kabila hasn't yet explicitly said that he wants to run again or try to change the constitution, but a lot of the actions of the government are speculating that he will go in that direction. And so we've seen that people of the opposition, also pro-democracy activists, have been targeted, but not only them. We see that even people who are part of the ruling coalition who spoke out against a third mandate have been arrested, they were detained, and they've been prosecuted and convicted.
So there is, in a sense, a backlash, you see, the idea that he could extend his rule. What is the main objection to that? Surely if he is doing good and doing well, as I understand they're not in a bad position necessarily for the country, what is the objection to actually letting him continue?
Well, the DRC constitution is quite clear on presidential term limits. So not only is there a two-term limit for 2 times 5 years, but in addition to that, there is an article in the constitution that says that this article that constitutes the term limits cannot be changed through a constitutional change. In addition to that, there is a third article that actually allows the population to rise up if somebody tries to take power by violence or tries to stay in power in a way that is not consistent with the constitution. So allegedly, this possibility of somebody trying to stay in power was anticipated when the constitution was drafted in 2006. And this can only be explained by the fact that the country was ruled by a dictator for such a long time that the people who were actually involved in the drafting of this constitution wanted to do everything to avoid that from happening again.
Thank you for that. But some African presidents might say, and I'm going to come to Ibrahima for this, some African presidents might say, well, what is wrong with having the popularity of the people who wish to have their president continue, vote for that, change their constitution? Why do we restrict ourselves to this kind of American stroke European idea that the president can only stay there for 2 terms? Ibrahima, is that a problem that you see that Africa is trying to restrict itself to 2 terms, when in fact in the rest of in parliamentary systems you don't have 2 terms. You can go on as long as you like, so long as you're popular.
You know, the main question here is first, do we need to use the population in violating the Constitution, or do we need to follow what the Constitution has stated and give every time the opportunity for other people to give chance to other people to show how they can run the country? You know, the countries, African countries, belong to all Africans. They don't belong to anybody. And also, many of the African constitutions that you mentioned that people are trying to change, those constitutions were clear about the number of terms that a president could do. I heard the brother from Rwanda explaining to us that this is the will of the people. But I just want to remind him that first, when Kagame last time won the election and sworn in, he sworn in by saying, I will fully respect the Constitution and I will fully respect the term, the second term. At the end of the second term, I will give up and give another Rwandese a chance to run the country. So for me, the fact that today people are changing the constitution in Rwanda and trying to make sure that Kagame continues, it's the failure of everybody. First, the failure of the Kagame regime not to be able to have a country that is run by a system that is democratic, accepted by everybody. 2, the possibility saying that there is no other person in the country who can run the system other than Kagame. I think it's just a kind of insult to the rest of the population, you know. And this is why in Africa, in many other parts of Africa, particularly in West Africa, people stood up. People stood up, and this is not very recent. Please remember that when the president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, at the end of his second term, he wanted to use the system to have the third term. He was stopped by his own people. When Abdoulaye Wade tried in Senegal to have a third term, he was stopped by his population. And the latest example is Burkina Faso. So I think this issue is not the issue of the population one. It's the issue that people who are in power are using.
Let me come in there, and let me come in there and address some of those issues. I'm going to ask Archie to address some of this, particularly the reference that has been made with regard to the way things are moving in Rwanda, because there is a sense that where a president is doing well and he becomes a uniting force, if you like, for the people around him, then what should be the objection to them going on another term or so? Archie, how do you respond to that allegation that, in a sense, it's abuse? It's not democratic in that sense, and it's not actually serving the people to have the presidency renewed against the constitution?
I think the current the African Union did make some good points about the fact that, you know, everyone should have a chance at running the country. I absolutely agree with that. But I think it's an oversimplification to say that it's always a sort of manigance or a maneuver by the very top to instrumentalize the people. I think the case of Rwanda is interesting because compared to DRC, compared to Burundi, compared to Congo, there are no protests, not one single protest in the country. Then some may argue, well, it's because there's a consensual form of politics and the opposition is fragmented or the opposition is abroad. But or the people are afraid to protest. These are some common arguments to explain why there are no protests in Rwanda. But I think if you look at all the other cases, like Burundi, Congo, the people are getting shot. The people are getting shot by police, and they're still protesting. So the fear component, I don't think is really there. And I think that indeed there are always people that will oppose it, but there's also a big popular component as well. You can't deny it. And I think ultimately it's up to the people to decide. So whether they protest or they accept, we should respect that, I think. That's in my view.
Okay. I mean, Evie, if President Kabila does decide to run, do you think we're looking at the same situation in Burundi? In a sense, there's been violence against it, an opposition to that rule, or are we going to see the sort of situation we've seen in Rwanda, where President Kagame has been, if you like, accepted by the people and allowed to continue? What will be the situation over there?
Yeah, no, we do think that there is a real risk that the situation of Burundi would occur in the DRC as well. And that's because we've seen what has been happening in the past almost 2 years. Initially, it seems like the president wanted to change the constitution, and he got second thoughts after seeing what happened in Burkina Faso. And so just in January of this year, the president there was a legislative proposal in which they wanted to change the electoral law and attach it to a general census of the population of the DRC, which is an exercise that can potentially take between 4 and 5 years. And so we saw mass protests in the street of Kinshasa, which led to dozens of people being killed by the police and to a number of arrests that we documented. So the population is very much likely to resist any type of change of the constitution or any attempt of the president to stick to power. In addition to that, in the DRC, the Catholic Church has also very clearly spoken out against any way of Kabila to stay in power. And they just yesterday actually published a communique where they called on the population to stay vigilant and to keep in mind this Article 64 of the Constitution that I mentioned earlier, that allows the population to resort to civil disobedience to prevent anyone from staying in power that is not in line with the Constitution.
We will see how things will develop over there. It's going to be some interesting times with all the difficulties that might face the country if President Kabila does decide to go ahead. I want to come to Ibrahima, and in particular, I want to ask you, because you were very vociferous against the idea of someone continuing their terms, but how would you respond to the idea that African presidents somehow, more than any other, seem to have this attachment to power that they simply don't want to leave? But actually, in some senses, that's good. Why? Why is it good? Because it means that there's stability. There is a constant theme, a constant thread in that country, and people can be stable and secure. How would you respond to that?
Well, if we use the argument of stability, do you think that after more than 28 years in running Zimbabwe, Mugabe made the country safe and stable?
Well,
do you think that Cameroon
do we think so?
No, I'm asking you, is stable? No, the fact that, it's the good health of democracy is that every 5-10 years we need to change. Change is important for the country. Change is important for the people, because they will have to think of how to lead the country to success. And one person cannot do that for 30, 40 years. We've seen that everywhere in the world where we have people who stay for longer to power, they completely destroy the country. Here, for example, if I take the case of Rwanda, you know, the leadership of Kagame the last 14 years, there is no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it that he changed the country. He put the country on the way. But Kagame is not the Messi. Kagame is a human being. If the argument that the brother from Rwanda gave us, but Kagame is a human being. If Kagame passed away tomorrow, what will happen in the country? It will be the country will be more destabilized than in the past. So that's why, for me, this continuity of trying to have third term is completely fragilized the democratic system in our country. It completely fragilized the democratic principles that we are all trying to follow. So I think it's very important that we all understand that when a constitution said people have 2 terms, the people understand that after 10 years or after 14 years, you have to hand over the power to other people who have other thinking and who can run the country. But here, when you look at, for example, what is happening in Rwanda these days, it means that the next 12 years, Kagame will be in power. Well, 12 years plus 20.
Well, I think they've
14.
changed that, haven't they? I think they've changed the constitution to a 5-year term instead of a 7-year term. So
they've changed it. The 5 years will start after the next 7 years. That's what is happening. So, which means 12 years ahead. 12 years plus 14 is 26 years.
Archie, can I just check that with you? What's the situation in Rwanda? How many years are we talking about in terms of President Kagame staying in power if he gets an extended period?
So actually, yeah, it's a little bit intricate. The new constitutional draft basically says that the incumbent only the current president at the time that the new constitution is passed, which means that this no-term limit will not apply to future presidents. So basically, he would have a third term of 7 years, and he could potentially have 2 more terms of 5 years. So he could technically stay in power for another 17 years. And I wanted to come back to what our colleague from the African Union said. I do want to agree with him on the point that even if it's a popular wish, even if it's popular demand that a president stay in power for longer, something you can observe around the continent is that presidents who are in power for a very long time, their leadership tends to degrade. If you look at Uganda in the 70s, the level of corruption, the level of development and all that was much stronger, say, 10, 15 years ago than it is now. The country is doing just fine, it is stable, but you know, as the head of state ages, the quality of leadership declines. I think that's an important argument as well to stay in the balance here. So we should look at the definitely on a case-by-case basis and not just make generalities just as if Africa is just one country.
So earlier you mentioned, Archie, that there is in fact some opposition to that. And in terms of civil societies, can I go back to Evie here? In terms of the civil societies in Democratic Republic of Congo, what will be their role? What kind of role can they have to overturn something like this or to stop this from happening?
Yeah, so what we've seen in DRC is that we have this new group in civil society, youth movements who have grown in DRC and who have very strong connections with youth movements in countries as Senegal and Burkina Faso. And we've seen also that they are growing in other countries. And we see, I think, this new generation of pro-democracy activists who are often youth activists. We even see them in countries like Angola, where we have a president who has been in power for over 30 years. And so we see that these youth groups, they actually have a very strong power to mobilize, but also we see what we saw in the protest in January is that it's a lot of the just general population that is very easily mobilized, because the population is quite frustrated at a social level, because there is this very big gap between politicians and civil society, who are a more elite class of the population, and then the very big majority who doesn't see change in the country, who doesn't see economic prosperity, and who is getting frustrated and fed up.
Thank you, Evie, very much indeed. And indeed, thank you to all of our guests. That's all we've got time for on the show. And we're going to be back next week at the same time. And you can watch previous episodes on the YouTube channel and send your comments to our email address. We'll leave you today with scenes of the Dutch ambassador to Sudan, Susan Blanchard, who swam across the Blue Nile at Khartoum on Saturday, along with 6 Dutch women to promote women's empowerment and to raise awareness for safe swimming in the river. The idea for the stunt came after Blanchard said she would swim the Nile if her embassy Facebook page got 10,000 likes, which of course it did. Until next week, have a good evening.